History often repeats itself. On the battlefields of the old front line, the criss-cross paths of two massive conflicts of the 20th century met, from Flanders to the Somme and beyond. Something a bit different for this podcast. We're going to look at how the criss-cross paths of two great wars come together, how the First World War meets with the Second World War in terms of the battlefields of the old Western Front. It's a subject that I've been interested in for a long time. I've been collecting images relating to this from local French and Belgian sources, but often largely from German sources, for quite a few years, and it's exposed just how much the battlefields of the First World War were affected by events in World War II. And most recently this has kind of re-emerged through a chat I had with Terry Wenham on his excellent podcast, and I'll put a link to that episode on the Old Frontline podcast website so you can listen to Terry's podcast as well. And if you don't subscribe to Terry's podcast, then I would recommend that you do, because it's an excellent First World War podcast of his journeys along the battlefields of the Great War. We also had a podcast supporters evening just this week looking at this very subject, and it was a kind of a preview, a precursor to what this podcast will be about. And a group of you who support the podcast via Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon came along, and we had a look at some images connected with what we're about to talk about in this podcast. And that's a good way of using how people support the podcast to give something back and also enhance what we do here with the podcast itself. And hopefully we'll do more of that going forward. If we look at Europe, and indeed, of course, the battlefields which were on mainland Europe in the approach to the Second World War in 1939, in that late 30s period, it was a period of a resurgence of interest in the Great War. It was only 2 decades since the end of the Great War, but in many respects, the general public seemed to have got a bit fed up with all these war memoirs that were being published, showing the darker side of the Great War. Perhaps it was too vivid, too raw for them. But in the 30s, there was this resurgence. There was a period in which the film Forgotten Men came out, highlighting the forgotten plight of veterans of the war in that period following 1918, and how so many of them had suffered in the Great Depression and through lack of employment. But by the late 30s, what you see, and a good indication of this, is a whole series of part work magazines that came out at that time detailing the history of the First World War. The World War was one of them, and 20 years after was another. And 20 years after was a whole series of magazines that was published showing the battlefields for the first time then and now. So this was then obviously during the 1914-18 period, and now was in the 30s. And they commissioned photographers to go round the battlefields with wartime images and do comparison shots showing how the battlefields had changed. And it's a great time capsule of information for us now, 80-odd years afterwards, because it shows us what the battlefields were like in the 30s and how different to how we know them today. And these magazines, these part work magazines, are not difficult to find. A very kind supporter of the podcast sent me a whole box load of them last year, for which I was very grateful, and I've used quite a few times for different things connected with the podcast. You can buy these on eBay. There are bound examples of them as well, and they're a good part of your First World War library to have. I can't put a link to them on the podcast website because they're long out of print, but if you search on sites like eBay, you'll find them. But those magazines, they kind of give us an indication that there was this renewed interest. And out on the battlefields themselves, the pilgrimage side of visiting those battlefields had probably never been busier. Perhaps travel was a bit easier. Perhaps people had a little bit more money to do that in the 30s than they had done in the 20s. There were still subsidised trips to the battlefields organised by organisations like the Ypres League and the British Legion. And it's been calculated that in that 30s period, something like 250,000 English-speaking people were visiting somewhere like Ypres, for example, each year. So we're not talking about an insignificant number of people. And again, the evidence that we have of that through publications like the Ypres Times, which is the journal of the Ypres League, through articles that were in 20 years after, newspaper articles of the period, and also, again, with photographs that I've collected over the years, albums showing people on pilgrimages during that period, it was obviously pretty common. And it makes you wonder, particularly in the late 30s, as Europe and the world was obviously beginning to change, and the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich was signalling not a new Germany, not a united Europe, but fractures and an approach to potentially a new war. How must those people who visited the battlefields in that period, how must they have felt? Not just the veterans having thought that they'd fought in the war to end all wars, the Great War for Civilization, as one of their medals stated. For them, it was a case, and there was a book published at that time called "And All for What?" And that phrase, "and all for what had it all been for?" was perhaps very, very prominent on the minds of the veterans and indeed the visitors to the battlefields who had lost family members there in that period. So there was a lot of people visiting the battlefields, and we see this again in the images from that period. Picture postcards showing the centre of Ypres, full of taxis awaiting to take people to cemeteries and battlefield sites, buses waiting to take people on tours, local tour guides, souvenir stalls. Ypres itself had risen from the ashes of the Great War. The Cloth Hall, the main building in the middle of Ypres, was as yet incomplete. Its main tower was finished, one wing of it was finished, another wing was still in ruins, and that wouldn't be finished until 1962, so not until after the Second World War. And around it, this industry had kind of built up, just as there has been a battlefield industry in recent decades around the period of the centenary of the Great War, with people providing accommodation, providing shops where you could buy things, food and drink and souvenirs and books and everything else, and museums and other things. So in that respect, the kind of battlefields went full circle from that interwar period up to more recent times. Out on the battlefields themselves, the cemeteries and the memorials had been finished. Nearly 2,000 cemeteries from Belgium down into France, from Britain and what was then the Empire. The Imperial War Graves Commission had finished those cemeteries. The last of the memorials to the missing, which had begun with ones like the Menin Gates and eventually Thiepval, that had ended with the construction of the Villers-Bretonneux Australian Memorial in July of 1938, less than 14 months before the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939. So the cemeteries and memorials had been complete. The wooden crosses had been transformed into the headstones. The cemeteries, the architecture with the stones of remembrance and the crosses of sacrifice, and the big monuments listing the missing, those who'd never returned, who could never be found, those were all done, were all complete. That landscape of the Great War, from a British and Empire point of view, was in place. And to a larger extent, that was the case with France. If we look at the rest of the Western Front, as we might call it, from beyond the Somme down towards the Vosges, France too had memorialised its dead, memorialised that generation who'd fought in the Great War, with cemeteries, with the regroupment of French dead to be buried in military cemeteries or taken back home to civilian cemeteries, with the construction of memorial sites like Navarin Farm in the Champagne, for example, or the ossuary at Douaumont, which itself was considered a warning against future war. The bones of 120,000 combatants who died at Verdun placed in that ossuary, and the tower with a beacon at the top reaching out across that sacred ground, warning future generations to never do this again. All of that was in place there too. So this new landscape had really developed out of the shattered landscape of the Great War, and it was now a landscape of remembrance, of reflection. And among it were pilgrims. The last British pilgrimage that I've come across, I was looking at some of the Sheffield newspapers, and a group from Sheffield went across in late August 1939, so weeks away from the outbreak of war. It wasn't a Sheffield City Battalion and Sheffield POWs tour. It was a group of people that had connections to Sheffield men who died in the conflict who went out there to visit graves. But it wasn't just British and Empire pilgrims visiting those battlefields. French families were visiting graves, but also at that time with the expansion of Germany under Hitler, Germans were travelling again, and they were travelling to the battlefields of the Western Front. There were meetups between veterans of both sides in that 30s period, and I have photographs of German families visiting graves on the battlefields in the late 1930s, probably for the very first time since the war. And in Germany itself, in the approach to war, there was a crisscross path of the Great War there too. If we take an example of that, with the Neue Wache in Berlin, in the Unter den Linden, the main street running through the heart of Berlin. This was an old Prussian guardhouse opposite the Berliner Schloss, where in the centuries before the Great War, Frederick the Great had held his court, amongst other places, and Prussian soldiers had marched off to war all over Europe. And this old Prussian guardhouse had become a place where a kind of changing of the guards took place on a regular basis. I have images of this before the Great War, during the Great War, and a whole series of photographs showing the Berliner Wacht Battalion, the Watch Battalion, marching in front of the Neue Wache, doing the changing of the guard and goose-stepping in front of the columns of the building. And that's something that went on even beyond the Second World War. When I went to Berlin during the Cold War period, for example, it was done by soldiers of the Neue Volksarmee, the East German army. They did exactly the same kind of thing there. But what that building was used for under the Third Reich, the Nazi regime, was to bring together their obsession with the Great War. Hitler and many of the leading Nazis had flouted their Great War connections, their Great War credibility in terms of being frontline soldiers. But here at the Neue Wache, that went one step forward in terms of placing a tomb of the unknown warrior here, Germany's unknown warrior from the Great War. Now, I say warrior, I have read some accounts that indicate multiple unknown soldiers were buried here. But whatever, it was turned into this sacrificial tomb. A monument was placed above it with a big wreath. There was a cross placed on the rear wall of the building, and there was permanent guards there from the Berlin battalion. And many, many families went there in the 30s and laid wreaths in exactly the same way. For example, British families had laid wreaths against the cenotaph in London. German families, not on the same scale, I don't believe. But again, I have photographs showing the monument surrounded by wreaths placed there by German families. Whether the body or bodies of those unknown German soldiers are still there, I don't know. Today, this building is a memorial to all of those who have died in conflict. And the memorial itself that was there during the 30s has gone. The wreath that sat on top of it is now in the Deutsche Historical Museum next door, the old artillery school. Well worth going in there to see their Great War period collections. But what is there instead is a Kati Kollwitz sculpture of a grieving mother. She was that German sculptor who sculpted those two statues. They're at Wladslo Cemetery in Flanders, showing a grieving mother and father based on her and her husband over the death of their son who had fallen in Flanders in 1914. Her work was considered degenerate artwork by the Nazis. It's incredible that she even survived the Second World War, but she did. And this figure of a grieving mother, symbolising every grieving mother who'd lost someone in conflict in the 20th century, was placed in this building, I believe after the unification period of Germany. And I mention this building because even outside of the battlefields of the Great War on the Western Front, there are still these criss-cross paths that take us through the history of that war and indeed into the next. And Berlin is a good example of that. Perhaps we'll have to return to Berlin properly in a podcast in a future date. But those photographs of the marching soldiers in front of the Neue Wache really echoed the approach of what was coming. And by 1938, it was clear to most people that a war was coming. 25th of September 1938, with the German invasion of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, Bruce Bairnsfather, one of the cartoonists of the Great War, published a new cartoon showing Adolf Hitler standing in front of the cenotaph in London, doing a Nazi salute. German bombers, these dark black bombers in the sky above London, and behind him, Old Bill, tapping him on the shoulder with one hand and then thumbing back towards the cenotaph behind him, saying, "Hang on a minute." And what he meant by that, I guess, was, hang on a minute, what was the sacrifice of 1 million war dead about if we're about to go to war again? and war was now pretty much inevitable, really. And even with the outbreak of that war, it takes us across these crisscross paths of the First World War, because the Germans invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Poland, a neutral country. It's re-emerged out of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 with the creation of the new nation of Poland. And with neutral countries, as we discovered in the Great War with Belgium, they needed a guarantor, and one of Poland's guarantors in 1939 was Britain. So when Adolf Hitler refused to negotiate further, refused to withdraw his troops from Poland in September 1939, Britain was obliged to go to war once more, and Chamberlain came on the radio to tell the nation that Britain was at war with Germany. Less than 21 years after the end of the Great War on the Western Front, with the signing of the armistice in November 1918, just enough time for another generation to grow from childhood into adulthood, Europe was at war once more, and the battlefields, so busy in that late 1930s period, were quiet. Although Poland was overrun by the Germans coming from the west and the Russians from the east, Britain didn't find itself in the heart of any fighting in those immediate months after the outbreak of the Second World War. It was feared that there would be widespread bombing of civilian targets. That too did not happen. The RAF took the fight to some locations within Germany. Bombers went to Wilhelmshaven and bombed the German naval base there, for example. But the British Expeditionary Force, the new BEF, had gone across to France after the outbreak of war in 1939 into what became known as the Phony War, Sitzkrieg rather than Blitzkrieg, where there was no fighting, but British troops were occupying a wide defensive line along the Franco-Belgian border. Some units went down to the Maginot Line, and one thing that did happen during that period when British troops were there, they did visit cemeteries from the First World War. There are photographs of men from the BEF in those cemeteries. My grandfather was one of them. I suspect that he probably went out and visited the odd cemetery or two, because he'd served at the end of the Great War in the Rifle Brigade and then gone into the Royal Army Medical Corps, and then was sent to Çanakkale in Turkey in the 1920s during the British occupation of that part of Turkey, and had worked on the construction of the cemeteries at Gallipoli, so had a bit of an interest himself in that subject, and may well have gone out to see one of the cemeteries that would have contrasted greatly with what he'd seen in Gallipoli when he was stationed in a little village near Douai during that Phony War period. I have a photograph of him standing in that village by the village church, wearing a First World War uniform with a more up-to-date cap on his head. So for him and many other members of the BEF who had served in the Great War, this must have felt a bit uncanny, really, standing close to the place where that war had been fought, often in the same kind of uniforms, close to where you'd survived it a first time. Would you survive it this time? That must have been in the back of the minds of many men who were there in 1939-40. But eventually, the Phony War turned into a real shooting war. In May 1940, the German Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, swept against Western Europe. Blitzkrieg in the west came through the Netherlands, through the Low Countries, through Belgium, and eventually, of course, into northern France and eastern France as well. In many respects, you could say that this was another crisscross path of both those wars, because the German attack in May 1940, you might argue, was not dissimilar to the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. It was essentially a Schlieffen Plan Mark II. And what it meant was that given that the German army was following a very similar plan, it would bring German troops and therefore the fighting into the very same areas where it had taken place a generation before in the Great War. So when we look at the different parts of those old battlefields where the fighting rolled through there, we'll start with Ypres, we'll start with Flanders. The German army came through there in May 1940, heading towards the Channel coast. British forces, after the outbreak of hostilities in terms of a fighting war, had crossed from France into neutral Belgium to assist the Belgian nation and to fight there. and those troops were gradually being pushed back through Belgium, through Wallonia, through the French-speaking parts. There was a lot of fighting around, for example, the city of Tournai, which was a city that had been behind the German lines until the very end of the First World War in 1918. But there were British cemeteries there from the First World War, and there would be cemeteries again from World War II from the fighting there in 1940. Then they were pushed back towards the coast, towards the canal lines. These were defended, and Ypres was in the path of this advance. So there was fighting along the old Menin Road. I have some photographs taken by a German soldier there in May 1940 showing their 37mm gun set up on the Menin Road with the old trackway of the tram system that ran along that road at that time, and some road signs above them saying Ypres in one direction and Menin in the other direction, so they're on the Menin Road. And then he took a second picture. It's not exactly clear where this photograph was taken, but when he took a second picture, behind them was a monument, and the memorial was the memorial to the 18th Eastern Division, which sits at Clapham Junction. So this gun had been set up close to that memorial, outside what had been known as Stirling Castle on the trench maps from the Great War, and fighting once again rolled around that area, just as it had done a generation before. Hill 60, an area of preserved British battlefields from the First World War, had been left in the 20s and 30s. There was a trench museum close by. That found itself in the path of the German advance, and there was fighting on the hill. The Australian observation bunker that sits there on top of an old German bunker that had been constructed in 1918 by the Australian engineers, that was used as a headquarters by many of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, and that came under fire, and some of the impact marks on the bunker are not from the First War, but from the fighting there in 1940. On the other side of the railway line, out towards the old Ypres-Commune Canal, around what we call the Bluff, which had been an area of static warfare for so many years of the Great War. The Germans came through there, and there was fighting in that area between the Bluff and the village of Saint-Éloi. In Saint-Éloi itself, you can see quite a lot of evidence of that fighting from May 1940, with impact marks on some of the buildings there. There's one big grain store where the front section of the building has taken a direct hit, and a shell has gone straight through the wall, and the fragments of that shell, the shrapnel from that shell, has impacted the brickwork, and you can see that very, very clearly. And buried close by in Bus House Cemetery are some of the men who were killed defending that ground. Now, some years ago, I've done 7 documentaries, believe it or not, about Dunkirk over the years, and I remember talking to someone and saying how one day there would be a documentary about the Americans at Dunkirk, kind of saying it jokingly, but actually I've discovered through some research I've done that quite a lot of Americans fought in the British Army during that retreat to Dunkirk and at Dunkirk itself. And one of them was killed here at Saint-Éloi in May 1940, Captain Fedor Bunge. He was in the Royal Artillery and Anti-Tank Regiment, and he was killed defending this village at that time. One of a number of Americans who, just as had happened in the beginning of the Great War, when Americans outraged that their nation had not gone to war with Germany, again in 1939, a lot of Americans outraged that they were not going to war with Nazi Germany this time. Then they came to Britain and joined the British forces, and Fedor Bunge was one of those. There was fighting too north of Ypres along the Yser Canal. When I first went to Essex Farm in 1982 on that very first school battlefield tour that I went on, the little bit of ground above the Essex Farm bunkers, they were flooded in those days and you needed welly boots to go into the different chambers. But the little grass field above it was used by a farmer for grazing cattle. And the gate was open. We wandered up on top of it, and part of the ground had been kicked away. The grass was gone, exposed some turf and exposed some earth underneath. And I could see a cartridge, a 303 cartridge. So I bent down and picked it up and took that away, thinking, great, I found my first Great War souvenir on my first visit to the battlefields. But when I looked at it later on, I saw that the date on it was actually from the Second World War. Now, at that time, I didn't realise that British troops had set up along the canal bank in 1940 during the defence of this area, using the canal as a defensive line, and this dated from that period of Ypres history, not from the First World War. And just down the road from there at Duhallow ADS Cemetery, a cemetery from the Great War near to an advanced dressing station, thus its name, a medical facility where the wounded had been brought in and many men had died of their wounds. That was also behind the canal bank, which was defended. And in there you can see in certain rows in the cemetery impact marks on the headstones where mortar rounds have dropped in the cemetery and exploded, and the shrapnel from them have impacted the headstones. Now, the Germans wouldn't have been targeting that cemetery, but they were probably trying to drop mortar bombs onto the British positions along the canal bank, overshot their target, and they landed in Duhallow Cemetery. So that's another kind of crisscross path where we can see some visible evidence of the war, the Second World War, in these First World War sites. The city of Ypres itself came under fire, both from German artillery and from aerial bombardment. I read in a Flemish book about this period of the Second World War that I think over 500 buildings in Ypres were damaged by these bombardments. Now, nothing on the scale of the First World War. It wasn't reduced to ruins, but you can see evidence of this in Ypres today. So if you come through the Menin Gate into Ypres and turn left into the street that runs along the edge of the ramparts, there's a school on the right-hand side, and the wall there, the brick wall there, has got a lot of shrapnel marks from where shells have landed and exploded. And you'll see this at different points on the lower sections of buildings in the Meninstraat, in the street that takes you from the Menin Gate up into the main square. And I've got some photographs taken by some Germans showing some of the big buildings, the restored buildings in the main square that had taken direct hits, and one of those collapsed in its central part and all the floors came down, and that took some years for that to be repaired. And of course, we've mentioned the Menin Gate. That too was damaged in this period. And there's a lot of stories about the Menin Gate and what happened to it. Certainly the British had an observation post on the top of it. You'd have got good views from there out towards the Menin Road and the approaching German tanks and armoured personnel carriers and everything else that was coming that way. And the Germans fired at it because of this. Possibly, one account claims that a 20mm anti-aircraft gun, self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, came around the corner and opened fire on targets that they could see British soldiers on top of the memorial. And the wartime photographs that we've got of the Menin Gate certainly show this to be the case, that there is damage from impact marks, not just what happened in front of the gate, which was an officer of the Royal Engineers blew the moat bridge to stop the Germans from getting into the city, and the cobbles and the detritus from the explosion blew back onto the gate and damaged the front face and some of the central columns of it. And again, when you go there now, where they play the last post, you can see the filled-in impact marks from where this damage was made good in the period after the Second World War. So Ypres was affected, the Menin Gate was affected, and the surrounding areas were affected. And when you read some of the memoirs of British soldiers who fought here in that period, they talk about going for cover from cemetery to cemetery, and cemeteries coming under fire. So there's probably quite a few areas of the battlefields where we see little nicks in cemetery walls or on the cross or in headstones, and we kind of pass that by, but actually it's probably a bit of evidence from the fighting there in World War II. And what it means, of course, as well, because there was fighting there, the road from Saint-Loire down towards the French border was used as a defensive line. There's quite a few cemeteries where you'll find graves from both world wars in there. Bedford House Cemetery being one of them, a special plot of World War II graves in a circular area of the cemetery on one of the raised bits near to where the old chateau in that cemetery had been. And when you go down the Messines Ridge to Oosterverne Wood Cemetery, there are several rows of casualties there from May of 1940, including men, when you look at their ages, old enough to have fought in the First World War, and no doubt there's some stories there. Moving down into the area of northern France, there was very heavy fighting around Arras in May of 1940. There was a British counter-attack against the German advance there in the villages just to the southwest and west of Arras itself. One of the cemeteries that's there, Duizon British Cemetery on the Roman road between Arras and St. Paul, or just south of it, it's got a very clear view from the front entrance, an archway at the front of the cemetery onto that Roman road. And in May 1940, a British anti-tank gun was set up in there, possibly by a battalion of the Durham Line Infantry, firing down that road. It came under fire from the advancing German troops, and you can see the impact marks all round the front entrance to that cemetery, indicating that battle damage from that period of the Second World War. Up at Mont Saint-Éloi near Vimy Ridge, the big tall towers of the old abbey there, the monastery, that was a battle ruin from the First World War, and that high ground, proved just as important in World War II with the neighbouring Notre Dame de Lorette and Vimy Ridge. and there was fighting involving British and French troops against the German forces coming through that area. And when you go into the communal cemetery at Mont-Saint-Éloi, you'll see a memorial to French troops, motorised infantry that fought there, some French graves and also some British graves of an anti-tank regiment and some others that fought alongside their French allies there in that Battle of May 1940. Up at Givenchy, near to the Le Basset Canal, where the front lines had been static for most of the First World War, and mines like the Red Dragon crater, they were blown. That's where William Hackett VC was awarded a posthumous VC in the Great War. When you walk across that ground, those canals, used as defensive lines by the BEF in 1940, again were scenes of fighting. And you go into the communal cemetery there and you find the grave of the 10th Earl of Coventry, who died as an officer with the 7th Battalion, the Worcestershire Regiment, on the 27th of May 1940, on the site where regiments like that had fought in the Great War. And again, just like up at Ypres, where there are cemeteries with graves from both the First and the Second World War in, you see that in this area, just up the road at Festubert. There was heavy fighting there, and the church has got visible battle damage on it. But a lot of the communal cemeteries in this area have graves from this period of the war. Often more 1940 graves in them than First World War graves. So it's an interesting journey when you go round this part of the Western Front battlefields, seeing just how these criss-cross paths meet at locations like this. Down on the old Somme battlefields, there was fighting, for example, between Peronne and Albert. German troops came across the Somme in that area, moved towards Albert, and this was in the line of the German advance. And one of the things that you see in a lot of the Somme cemeteries that we know so well was the burial of German dead there. I have some photographs of different cemeteries showing plots with German dead from 1940 placed alongside the British and Empire graves from the Great War. One of the most recent images I turned up like this, for example, is of Contalmaison Chateau Cemetery, with the graves of 3 German soldiers placed close to the Cross of Sacrifice. And it's not a very clear image, but when you zoom in on it, you can read the names on the board where the crosses are, and those 3 men are now buried in Bourdon German Cemetery near Amiens, which is the main German Second World War cemetery for that area of the Somme and northern France. So when we go to the British cemeteries on the Somme today, there were some later additions in World War II with the burial of German dead, which remained there until after the Second World War period, when they were concentrated into a German military cemetery. Villers-Bretonneux, which we mentioned as the last memorial built before the outbreak of the Second World War, which we discussed in a recent podcast, that too came under attack. The tower was damaged, the monument was damaged, the cemetery was damaged. That sat close to the main Saint-Quentin-Amiens road. Just as that had been an axis of advance in 1918, exactly the same thing happened there in 1940. And that area close to Amiens, there was a lot of the British militia units that were part of the BEF, including some of the territorial battalions, the 7th Royal Sussex being an example of this. They found themselves having been guarding petrol dumps and supply dumps suddenly in the path of the German advance. And a lot of men from the Great War who'd served in the Great War were serving in units like this. One of them that I've researched is Major James Cassell's MC. He'd served with the South Downs Battalions of the Royal Sussex in the Great War. He came from a little village near Horsham in West Sussex. And I spoke to his wife some years ago when I was doing some research on the South Downs, and I hadn't realised that he'd been killed in the Second World War. And it's through making contact with the family that I discovered this. And what happened to him was he was fighting in a little village southwest of Amiens when the battalion was overrun. And some of the veterans that I've spoken to who were in that battalion said that what happened was he gave the order to surrender when they'd run out of ammunition, and it was pointless to carry on fighting, and he was shot by one of the German soldiers. So one of many instances in 1940 in which British prisoners of war were shot in cold blood by the Germans. Not just the big massacres that we know about in northern France, but this happened on a widespread basis. And not far away in the valley of the Somme, French colonial troops who had that proud record of service in the Great War in battlefields like Verdun, for example, they were fighting there in that part of France just prior to the eventual collapse of France under the weight of this German attack in 1940. And many of those colonial soldiers from France's colonies in Africa were rounded up by the Germans and were executed. There's been a lot of recent research on this. So some quite dark echoes, really, of the conflict in these places where the paths of the Great War and the Second World War crisscross. Now, we've journeyed from Ypres down to the Somme, but of course, using that phrase, the rest of the Western Front beyond the Somme, fighting was taking place there as well. So when we look at battlefields like the Marne and the Meuse-Argonne and the area around Verdun and right over towards the Vosges, there was fighting in all of these places in 1940 and indeed beyond them. Memorials and battlefield sites were damaged in the fighting. There's a demarcation stone, for example, not far from the Mans de Massige in the Champagne, where the top half of it has been shaved off by a German shell that went along that road trying to knock out a French tank, I would guess, in May of 1940. And quite a few demarcation stones were destroyed at the beginning of the Second World War. Again, not necessarily deliberately, but they found themselves in the midst of fighting in these areas as it rolled across this ground during that period of the conflict. American memorials from the Great War were damaged as well. The 37th Division Memorial Bridge at Oudenarde was blown up during the withdrawal across that part of Belgium, for example. Down on the Maginot Line, which was built only 40-odd kilometres away from the forts of Verdun. In fact, when you stand on the roof of the Maginot Line complex at Fermont, you can look across the forests of Verdun and see the tower of the Ossuary of Douaumont. And that is a place where you feel that the Second World War meets very, very clearly with the First. As the Germans advanced on Paris, that took them over the Chemin des Dames, down towards the Marne, just as German troops had done exactly the same thing in 1914, this time unfortunately successfully, and a lot of places there got damaged. There's a very large German cemetery on the Chemin des Dames from the Second World War, one of the largest German cemeteries in that part of France, with the dead from World War II in it. And close by, not far from there, is the Moulin de la Faux, which is a major French battlefield from the Great War. There's a big monument there to the Crapouillots. These were the French trench mortar troops in the First World War. It's a big French trench mortar bomb standing on its fins, and there are photographs of that having been impacted by tank shells during the fighting that rolled across that ground. And with the collapse of France and its eventual surrender, history repeated itself once more, because the armistice signed between the Germans and the French ending the war in the West was signed on the deliberate orders of Adolf Hitler in one of the armistice carriages in the forest at Compiègne to humiliate France in 1940. This was deliberately done, and then the carriage was taken off to Germany. It was exhibited not far from the Neuerwache, which we spoke of earlier, in what was called the Lustgarten on the Museum Island in Berlin. And this was an area where war trophies had been placed in the Great War and where Hitler would do exactly the same thing in the Second World War. And the armistice carriage was placed on display there, and you could go and visit it as a German citizen of Berlin, and then you'd give money towards the war effort. And eventually it wasn't destroyed in the Battle of Berlin in 1945, which many people believe. It was taken off to a forest way away from Berlin, where it was deliberately blown up. And when you go to the Compiègne Armistice Museum now, you see not a reproduction of the original carriage. It's an identical one from the same period, with some of the original artifacts within it. And then you also see the recovered artifacts from an archaeological dig from where the original carriage was blown up in that German forest. And with the signing of the armistice in June 1940, German troops then marched to humiliate France further down the Champs-Élysées. And again, I have many photographs of German soldiers standing at the tomb of France's unknown warrior under the Arc de Triomphe. And one wonders what French people would have made of that. After the surrender of France and the end of that war in the West, Adolf Hitler went on a battlefield tour along the old Western Front battlefields. He came over with some of the men that he'd fought with, and they went round and toured some of the sites where he'd been. And he went to some key symbolic locations, and this was heavily photographed and heavily filmed. We discussed this in the podcast episode about Langemarck, but he went to Langemarck. He tried to associate himself with the Battle of Langemarck in 1914, which had taken on greater symbolism in that post-war period, particularly under the Nazis, where they created a Langemarck Day. And one of the bells in the 1936 Berlin Olympic Stadium had been a Langemarck bell. There were Langemarck Strasses across different towns and villages in Germany as well. So he went there to this great symbolic Great War location for Germany and was photographed, and he was filmed there, and he walked past that plaque with his favourite saying on it, or said to be one of his favourite sayings, Deutschland muss leben und wenn wir sterben müssen, Germany must live even if we must die. And of course Germans had just recently been dying for Germany once more in the battles of 1939-40. He went from there into Ypres. He visited the Meningate, was photographed there, photographed in the main square. He went down to Messines, where he'd been in the early period of the Great War. He went to one of the farms where he'd been billeted and visited the family who'd looked after him in that early period of the Great War. And then he went to Fromelles, an area where he'd spent well over a year, the longest period he'd spent on any one part of the front, and visited a house where he'd been billeted during that time, and a plaque went up on the wall, Here the Führer slept, and that remained there until September 1944 when it was smashed up, but one of the locals recovered the bits, and it's now in the collection of the Fromelles Museum. And then most notably, certainly from a British and Empire, British and Commonwealth perspective, he went to visit Vimy Ridge and the Vimy Memorial. Now, there are quite a few accounts that claim that this was his favourite memorial. I've not seen that in black and white from a German source myself, but he certainly went there, and I think that probably had more to do with the fact as to when Vimy was unveiled with that big ceremony with 10,000 Canadians. That was in July of 1936, in the year of the Berlin Olympics, a year of great symbolism for Adolf Hitler in the way Germany had risen like that phoenix from the ashes of the Great War. And I suspect he probably wanted to see this memorial, which had been plastered over every newspaper. There'd been film of it, live radio broadcasts, and he went there to see this memorial, which is an impressive memorial, as we know, and he was impressed by it. And again, there are accounts saying that Hitler feared that the German soldiers might damage it or desecrate it, so he put an SS guard on the memorial to protect it. But again, I have never seen any evidence of this. The German propaganda machine, I think, would have made something of it, shown how magnanimous they were in victory by guarding a former enemy's memorial. And if you want to discover more about this battlefield tour that Hitler did, because it gives us an interesting insight into the German mindset about different aspects of those First World War battlefields, and we see how those criss-cross paths of World War I and World War II came together in those visits. There's a very good Flemish book about the Flemish images that were taken during that period. There's an edition of the After the Battle magazine, which is now being published by Pen and Sword in Barnsley, that is dedicated to the photographs taken during that tour. And if you ever find yourself in the Ardennes, there's a little village called Brûlé-le-Pesque, where there's a Hitler bunker, one of a few Hitler bunkers, where he sheltered in that bunker during the Battle of France in 1940, and then went on his tour from there to visit those First World War sites. The bunker is preserved, and there's a museum explaining the history of it, and a museum of the Belgian resistance in that area. And as part of the display, they have the photographs that were taken during his visit from there. So if you ever find yourself in that area, you can go and look at these photographs close to the point where he went off to make all of those different visits. But with the end of the war in the West, the battlefields were quiet once more. They'd been busy in that late 30s period, and a different kind of busy with the fighting there in May and June of 1940. And now, with the long years of occupation ahead. The approach to liberation came with the Allied landings in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, D-Day, and in the 77 days that followed the Battle of Normandy, the breakout across France began. British troops advanced over the Seine and then up towards the Somme, thinking the Germans would defend the Somme area, but they didn't. They pulled back to the Belgian-French border. And what that meant was that the paths of the Second World War would once again cross through the old battlefields of the Great War. But before that happened, there was 4 long years of occupation. What happened to the cemeteries and memorials during that period? After that battlefield tour of Hitler's, he's said to have given an order that the cemeteries and memorials from the Great War should be left alone and respected. And during those 4 years, generally they were. But not always. There were certain memorials the Germans objected to. The British Zeebrugge Memorial commemorating the Zeebrugge raid of April 1918, which showed St George slaying the dragon, that was destroyed by German dynamite in 1940. The French gas attack memorial at Steenstraat that accused the Germans of crimes against humanity for having used gas for the first time, that was destroyed by the Germans as well. On Mont St Quentin near Peronne was the memorial to the 2nd Australian Division, a huge bronze statue of an Australian soldier with his foot on the neck of an Imperial German eagle, bayoneting it in the belly. And for some reason, the Germans didn't like that, and they blew that up. And there were quite a few French war memorials that were not dissimilar to that showed French poilus standing on a crushed Prussian eagle, and they were pulled down or blown up as well. So not everything was saved, not everything was respected. But the cemeteries largely were untouched. There had been some, as we've said, that were damaged in the fighting of 1940. And once the occupation was in full swing, once there were German troops garrisoned and then later Italian troops, particularly on the Somme, garrisoned in these areas, it seems that they visited these sites. I've mentioned before on this podcast how I went to Wagon Road Cemetery near Beaumont Hamel in the 1980s, and the cemetery's visitor book went back to the 1930s, and quite a few of the names in it were German soldiers who had signed it during that period of occupation. For them, these were the names of Great War battles that they'd probably grown up hearing about from their own fathers, from their own family. So they were curious to go out and find out more. And it wasn't just on the British sector. There are plenty of photographs of Germans visiting sites in the Marne, in the Meuse-Argonne, Verdun, and many other battlefields, French battlefields, where the German army had been battling with the French during those 4 years of the Great War. We often get asked on battlefield tours, were any of these cemeteries destroyed? And I remember reading in Philip Longworth's account of the history of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission a chapter where he mentions that Blighty Valley on the Somme had been torn up during the Second World War. Now this surprised me because I'd not ever come across this, and I went to have a look at the cemetery and it didn't really show any signs of damage. And when we had our podcast supporters meeting recently, I mentioned this story, and somebody said that they'd seen a photograph of it that had been posted, I think, on the Great War Forum from about 1946 showing the cemetery intact. So how that story came about, I don't know. But generally speaking, it appears that no cemeteries were deliberately damaged. And again, jumping on to the kind of liberation period, what that means is that the Imperial War Graves Commission, who sent staff over to follow on the tail of 21st Army Group as it advanced across France towards Belgium, thought they were going to probably come to sites where the cemeteries were and find them destroyed or damaged. And they did find some cemeteries where the headstones had fallen over through neglect or where the grass was up above the headstones, but generally they were in pretty good condition. And this was because the workforce that had worked there before the Second World War, the Imperial War Graves Commission gardeners, some of those had fled to Dunkirk in 1940 and got away, others had remained behind. And although some were sent off to prisoner of war camps, or in some cases, very sadly, concentration camps, some gardeners were allowed to continue to work. And famously, one of these was Ben Leach at Sayre Road No. 2 Cemetery on the northern part of the Somme battlefields. He'd fought on the Somme in 1916 as a soldier in the Manchester POWs, and he'd stayed behind and worked for the Commission in that interwar period. He remained at his post, and Sayre Road is a big cemetery. At the back of it, where the curved wall is and the cross of sacrifice, that's where the tool shed is, and it's almost invisible from the road. It's as if it's not there. And he used that tool shed to shelter, I think, nearly 30 shot down Allied airmen that were being evacuated down the evacuation chain by the French resistance. So his work there saved many lives, and he was decorated, I think, with the MBE after the war for his services to shot down airmen. Some of those that were sent off to camps never returned. Some years ago, when I went to Krakow War Cemetery in Poland, there's a big Second World War plot of British graves in the main cemetery there, close to the Russian graves and the Polish graves and the German plot that's in that cemetery. And I noticed a couple of Imperial War Graves Commission gardeners' headstones, and these were men who had worked on cemeteries on the Western Front, had been sent off to prisoner of war camps, and I think in this case the camp they were in had either been bombed or the factory that were being forced to work in had been bombed, and they became casualties. So it's an interesting story just with the gardeners alone. and what happened to them when the war came. But with the liberation came that chance to see what states these battlefields were in, what state these cemeteries and memorials were in. And that was not without some degree of fighting as well, because although the Germans had not defended the River Somme in 1944, there were some delaying actions in different locations around Amiens and Albert. British and American troops bumped SS units around Albert, for example, as they were pulling back towards Bapaume and Cambrai. So there was some small-scale fighting, nothing on the scale of the First World War, obviously, but there are some graves from that period in different Somme cemeteries, mainly communal ones. The main roads that ran through the Somme battlefield, the Amiens-Albert and the Albert-Bapaume road, were main axis of advance for British and American units. The main Amiens to Arras road saw the Guards Armoured Division advancing up through there, up towards Arras to liberate an area where Guards units had fought at the very beginning of the Second World War in 1940. The Welsh Guards, one of their men had been awarded the Victoria Cross at Arras in May 1940, and the Welsh Guards were the first unit into Arras in September 1944, and that took them up through those old battlefield areas of the Great War. And there's a very good memoir of this period of the Second World War called So Few Got Through, by an officer who was in the 51st Highland Division, and the title refers to the fact that so few men who'd landed in Normandy got through to the end of the war in Germany in May 1945. And he recounts in there, as they came up along these roads, these Roman roads of northern France, and they saw the cemeteries from the Great War out in the fields around them, they suddenly realised that they were in the battlefields of their father's war, as he calls it. And he notes that they passed through that area in less than an hour, but yet their fathers had been landlocked in the trenches of that part of the Western Front for almost 4 years. What the contrast between those two conflicts was like, really. And up round Arras, for example, when the 11th Armoured Division went up through there, a Daimler Dingo went up onto Vimy Ridge and declared it back in Allied hands, a great contrast to the Canadian assault there in April of 1917 and how many lives that cost. I have a little collection of images of a Royal Engineer officer who's in 21st Army Group, and when he got to the Somme in September 1944, he went to a number of locations. He must have had some kind of connection, I think, to the Great War, perhaps through his father, or perhaps through a member of the family who was killed there. But he went into the trenches of the Newfoundland Park, and his photographs show them overgrown and almost abandoned, really. The big wooden cabin that had been constructed for the superintendent of the park before the war was still there. He photographed that, and he photographed him and his mates in the trenches. And then he went across to Thiepval and he took some photographs, some not particularly good photographs, but the fact that they are slightly out of focus and quite dark shows two figures of French women walking up towards the Thiepval Memorial in this kind of symbolic moment where for the first time British troops have returned to this former battlefield of the Great War. And then he went to the Ulster Tower, and that's very overgrown in front of it. He obviously managed to get in, even if the door was locked. He got in there and he went up to the top of the tower, as you used to do when I first used to go across to the battlefields, and he took some photographs up there across the landscape showing Connaught Cemetery, a much smaller Thiepval Wood behind it, and then the big monument in the distance, and in the fields clear chalk marks of the old trenches from the Battle of the Somme. Elsewhere, Polish troops of 21st Army Group, General Maczek's 1st Polish Armoured Division, had broken out of Normandy, crossed the Seine, moved up through northern France, and they were heading towards the Belgian border. The Germans decided not to defend that either. They pulled back across Belgium to the Dutch border, and that's where Operation Market Garden would begin in September of 1944. But before that happened, Polish troops crossed the border and they got into Ypres on the 6th of September 1944. Not without any kind of fight. There was a small-scale action there and there were some casualties, and again there is some battle damage from that period of the fighting in World War II around Ypres. But what it meant symbolically, that Ypres was now liberated. On the evening of the 6th of September 1944, Polish troops, British troops who were attached to them, paraded underneath the Menin Gate at Ypres, the last posts, the bugles that had been hidden for those 4 years when the Germans had forbidden the playing of the last post underneath the Menin Gate. The bugles came out of hiding. The last post was played on that evening, the 6th of September 1944, and has been played every single evening ever since. It was the beginning of that new continuum of remembrance that continues to this day. And from there, the Poles continued their advance across Belgium over towards that Belgian-Dutch border, close to where the advance on Arnhem would begin a couple of weeks later. And what that meant was that by then, the old battlefields, the British part of the old battlefields from the Great War, had been almost entirely liberated. Elsewhere, this wasn't quite the same, because American troops under General Patton, once Paris had been liberated, had gone east into the Lorraine, into the eastern part of France, heading towards the Vosges and the German border beyond. And his troops had come up against stiff opposition in that area. There'd actually been a German counterattack, or there would be a German counterattack later on in 1944 to try and push the Americans back. And his men found themselves fighting over the same ground where American soldiers had fought in 1918. And there are quite a few official American photographs from that 1944 period showing American GIs looking at monuments to their own division, but not from that war, from the previous war, and pictures of American GIs in trenches or in bunkers from World War I. So there was quite a lot of fighting there. And some of the old forts from that area were fought over as well. This was a question that came up in the podcast evening we had recently. And Fort Drion near Metz, which actually was a German fort, a Kaiser period fort from before the Great War, when Metz was part of Alsace-Lorraine, which had been annexed by the Germans after 1871. That fort, built by the Germans, was defended by German troops in September-October 1944. Something like 30,000 GIs were up against 1,000 German troops in a very tough battle there. So some of this ground was fought over again. And the Lorraine American Cemetery, which is the largest Second World War cemetery in France, has graves from men killed in the battles around these old World War I battlefield sites, and were then moved there for reburial in a main American cemetery, as was the practice after World War II. By the autumn of 1944, American troops and the Free French troops that were attached to them, they had made their way down into the Vosges, and that area of France was liberated too. And what that meant that was by then, the battlefields of the Great War were no longer under German occupation. That phase of the Second World War for them had ended. The war was yet to be concluded. Canadian troops came to Vimy on the 11th of November 1944 and paraded on the steps of the Vimy Memorial. Canadian troops would continue to fight in northwest Europe right up to the very last day of the war. And many of the faces staring out of the photographs that were taken on the steps of the Vimy Memorial perhaps would not yet survive World War II. Down in the Vosges, with the clearing of the ground around Perfetta House, where the Western Front in the Great War had come to an end, this marked that move from war to peace. The old front line had become a new front line. Another generation had trod its paths not as pilgrims but as soldiers, just like the generation that had fought there between 1914 and 18. So when we travel along these battlefields of the Great War, we can never see them in isolation. The stories we uncover on these former battlefields are rich, they have depth, and when we understand that the criss-cross paths of two great wars come together, they come together here on the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.